Good evening, everyone, and welcome here this evening. Ayaan, Hirsi Ali does not need any introduction from me. Her life story is one of courage, and her work throughout the years as an activist, writer, former politician, projects the clarity and, I think, the precision of her intellect across some of the most defining issues of the 21st century. Hirsi Ali's life has been touched by turbulence and grief. Born in Somalia, her parents took their family to live in Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia before finally settling in Kenya. An independent thinker from a young age, Hirsi Ali rejected the social and religious norms of her society and, by extension, her family. She has said in the past that, "I did not want to repeat the life of my mother." With grit and determination, she left behind her family and the only life they were willing to allow her to live. But we must pause here for a second, I think, and reflect on what that leaving really meant for a young woman. The love of a mother, a father, of friends, childhood memories, sounds, smells, scenes that were constituent parts of what she once called home. Her bravery, I believe, is not just in her determination to break down the ideology derived from those on the religious extremist fringe. That kind of ideology that leads to child and forced marriages, honour killings, and female genital mutilation. Her bravery is not just living with a daily security threat after the horrific murder of a former colleague and close friend. Her bravery is that she has never let any of this hold her back from the life that she wanted. She got married, she had children, and she continued to use her voice on behalf of Muslim women, migrant women all over the globe. Her bravery is in her resilience and her ability to look forward. It's that bravery to look to the future, to absorb the grief of what she has lost and left behind, that means her enemies will never, ever win. Thank you.
Fiona, thank you very much for that incredibly gracious introduction. When I first accepted the invitation to come and speak here, I didn't know that it was called the Oakeshott Lectures. It was the Scruton Lectures. And I think Roger Scruton, if he were here today, would want me to compliment you on the beauty of this room. This incredibly beautiful hall that is big enough to hold all of you and yet feels so cozy. The word cozy stayed with me, gezellig, for my years in Holland. Well, the title of my lecture is called Irreconcilable Values, Immigration, Islamism, and the West. And Fiona and I, in the waiting room, were joking about how I was saying what I'm about to say now for the last 20 years. Well, I'll do it again. The West was shocked last year when, on October 7th, Hamas murdered and raped more than 1,200 civilians and abducted 254 hostages. We expected condemnation of Israel's ensuing war of self-defense to come from states which sponsor terror, like Iran. But what many did not expect was to see the streets of European cities and America's college campuses filled with their fellow citizens celebrating a massacre. There are two groups at these protests. The first are mainly Western students and lifelong Western social activists or socialists. Both have been indoctrinated into a suicidal self-hatred. They support Islamist causes which would have them killed for apostasy. As Prime Minister Netanyahu joked before Congress a pun that is now almost a cliche. Protesters who hold up signs proclaiming gays for Gaza might as well hold up signs saying chickens for KFC. Konstantin Kissing interviewed an English student at one of these protests holding a sign calling for a socialist intifada. The student admitted to having picked up the sign and carried it without knowing what intifada means. A student. Had he known that intifada means a violent uprising to remove all Jews from Israel, perhaps he would have thought twice. If he had only read Hamas's covenant before marching in the street for them, he would have encountered a quote from Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, which says, and I quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. He would have found that it rejects so-called peaceful solutions and international conferences as being in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. He would have read the explicitly genocidal statements in Article 7, citing Sahih al-Bukhari's notorious Hadith 29:26, and I quote, "The hour will not be established until you fight with the Jews, and the stone behind which a Jew will be hiding will say, 'O Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, so come, kill him.'" The Western liberals and socialists on these marches are what the Soviet communists would have called useful idiots. Despite being profoundly anti-Christian, they act as if they must atone for their sins of their ancestors. This allows them to be exploited by Islamists who want to render the West defenseless to da'wah, the ideological conquest of Islam. Those who denied the rapes and barbarities by Hamas sound like Walter Duranty, who wrote, and I quote, "Russians hungry but not starving," in the New York Times. Stalin's Western apologists hid the fact that between 4 and 10 million Ukrainian kulaks were murdered during the Holodomor. Duranty said of these famines in 1933 that, to put it brutally, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Perhaps the same lefty, wealthy, well-educated Westerners who excused the genocides of Stalin, if transported to the present day, would wear a keffiyeh and chant "From the river to the sea," knowing full well which river and which sea. I fear that this self-hatred runs so deep that had their family members been butchered on that day in Reim, they would still find a way to excuse it. Solzhenitsyn said there were prisoners in the Soviet gulags who knew of their innocence, but confessed to crimes they had not committed out of loyalty to the communist ideology. He told the story of how a daughter wrote to her mother, telling her she would not join the Komsomol if she was wrongfully imprisoned, but if she were guilty, she would never write to her again. The mother, out of loyalty to the party, told her daughter she was guilty and to join the Komsomol. Solzhenitsyn's stories cut through the lies told by Duranty and exposed the true face of the Soviet Empire. Dissidents of Islam like me had hoped that we might do the same. I boarded a train to the Netherlands in 1992 to escape a marriage arranged by my own family. I fled the imprisonment of the mind and repression of the Muslim woman. After September 9/11, 2001, I made it my mission to warn the West to not fall prey to the deceptively soothing prescriptions of the multiculturalists, to accept and even empower Islamists on their own terms. But I feel now that after October the 7th, I'm giving the same warnings as when the planes collided with the Twin Towers in 2001. How can it be that my adopted home has not learned her lesson? We can find our answers in the meaning of the word idiot. In ancient Greece, it means a private person or individual that is someone cut off from their civilization, their family, their religion, a flower without roots, destined to wither and die. Roger Scruton's word for such people was oikophobe, a person who repudiates their inheritance and home. People who think that believing British and Western history is superior is to be hoodwinked by imperial illusions into accepting their dominion. There is a saying, quote, "There are no atheists in foxholes." Well, there appear to be no oikophobes in Israel. My friend Douglas Murray often speaks about the immense courage he has witnessed by young Israelis enlisting in the IDF, risking their lives to defend their country after the 7th. They are not afflicted by the same self-hatred, the same hatred of home, of history and heritage as our young people in the West are. Why is this? Larry Siedentop has a great book on the origins of ancient city-states. He explains that cities formed from tribes. Tribes are a collection of families who worship the same gods. Homes were temples to ancestors with the line worshipped on the father's side. People were not individuals with rights, but members of families, ancestral lines, tribes, and city-states. Your identity was not your race or your sexuality or what made you different from others. It was the ties of blood and belief that you shared with those around you. Families came together, intermarried, and worshipped the same gods to expand their tribes into a city-state. The definition of a citizen was a man who had the religion of the city. To be stateless was to be without a family, a faith, a tribe, to be an idiot. There are no idiots in Israel today, because Israel is sustained by a strong collective identity. Israel has come from a distinct people with a story to tell about where they come from and where their home is. They've retained the sense of being a tribe, a family, a faith, a state. This is reinforced by having enemies around them on all sides. The author, Paul Morland, suggests that this is why Israel has a high birth rate compared to the West. He explains that many Jews see having families as a duty to secure the continued existence of the Jewish people after the Holocaust. Founding Prime Minister Ben-Gurion said that if Israelis began having large families, quote, "I would no longer fear for Israel's fate." In the face of annihilation, Israel has found the courage to continue bringing children into the world. The threats posed to Israel from outside only strengthen their resolve. It is this unified sense of self as a people with a shared faith in a particular place which gives Israel the courage to defend itself. That feeling of closeness, of shared identity, made Hamas's attacks all the more painful. Due to the size of their population, October 7 was like having 12 9/11s all at once. If we cannot understand why they fought back and fight back as they do, then it's us who are wrong. Professor David Starkey, who spoke earlier, told a story in a recent interview about how a Jewish friend invited him to Passover. He said, and I quote, "Here was this man suddenly becoming the high priest in his own household, and I found it moving. At Passover, the father of the house resumes the ancient role of patriarch. He honors his ancestors by telling the story of their exodus from Egypt. The family eats food to remind them of the decades of suffering for their faith. Remembering the sacrifices of their ancestors becomes inseparable from worshiping God. This is why Israel is fighting Hamas. They do so to defend the land of their ancestors so that their children might inherit it." This is how Edmund Burke defined a society, a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. A conservative is someone who seeks to keep this covenant with their ancestors and their children. Burke opposed the French Revolution because they sought to dissolve society into an unsocial, uncivil, unconnected chaos of elementary principles. That is what the socialists and useful idiots supporting Intifada are promising us today. But why is such a word on the lips of Western liberals? Because the West is weak. My heart breaks to say this about my home, that is my Western home, the civilization I chose, knowing the alternatives. I've come to love it as if I've inherited it. My children are of this place, and I'm raising them to be grateful to it. But others in ignorance and ingratitude have cast off that inheritance, and they turn to ideology instead. Whereas Israel has a pre-modern identity, they prudently modernized. The West is in danger of adopting a post-modernist identity and falling into primitivism. It has grown so skeptical that it can no longer justify its own history, its own culture, its own existence. A hermeneutics of suspicion is introduced, telling them to second-guess everything they think is great about their culture. Children are taught a revised version of our history in which we are uniquely guilty of sins of racism, colonialism, and slavery. Children are taught that their ancestors are to blame for all the world's problems, and that those of people with a different skin color would be better off had they never interacted with the European empires. They are not told that the United Nations says there are over 40 million people enslaved today, including over 15 million in forced marriages, the fate I avoided. 1 in 4 of those slaves are children. They are not taught that the West is not to blame for this. They are not taught that for 60 years, the British used its navy to end the transatlantic slave trade. They freed 150,000 Africans from slavery, for which 17,000 sailors sacrificed their lives. Historians have called this the most expensive moral aid venture in history. Moral aid, foreign adventure. They're not taught that 24 million sub-Saharan Africans were sold into slavery by other Africans. They are not taught that the Arab slave trade sold 11 to 17 million slaves, and that it's still going on today. They're not taught that Barbary pirates stole 250,000 Europeans as slaves. Western children today are not taught that America fought a bloody civil war that almost split it up in order to end slavery. They are not taught that Westerners frequently dedicate their scientific, technological, and medical innovations to save the lives of millions and millions of Africans and Asians. They are not taught of the efforts here at home to end colonialism or the reparations that Western countries pay annually in the form of foreign aid. They're not taught about all the Christian and humanist charities and volunteers active in Africa and in Asia, among other places. These truths are hidden from our children to make them hate their nations and their civilization. Woke socialists talk to them of settlers and oppressors, but they have no clue who's doing the settling and the oppressing. In 1961, Khrushchev advocated for wars of national liberation across the world. Ever since then, Western Marxists have waged a war against their own culture on behalf of those in the Third World. They elevate foreign cultures as superior to those in the West. These are foreign cultures they barely understand, in the hopes that they have not yet been corrupted by capitalism and so may inspire a revolution. As the anti-colonial Marxist Frantz Fanon wrote, quote, "To shoot down a European is to kill two birds with one stone. You kill the man and his culture at the same time." This is why, as Professor Starkey has spoken about before, the United Nations Human Rights Declaration was subverted by the Soviet Union. The purpose became to protect minorities, in practice, weaponizing them against European majorities. Our young people then delay the day at which they have their own children, often until it's too late. Unlike Israel, Europe and America's relative distance to the realities of Islam press no urgency upon its population to secure the nation's future. Because we do not have enough children, we are told, we need migrants to fill vacancies in the labor market. As I have written about before, and many others have done, this is a fantasy. In the Netherlands, the average immigrant from the Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, and Turkey are never net tax contributors across their lifespan. Both first and second generations cost the Dutch 27 billion every year. In the UK, by the time a low-wage immigrant reaches the age of 81, they will have cost taxpayers £465,000. That is 60% of immigrants on work visas every year since 2019. Almost 3/4 of jobs in Britain have gone to immigrants since 2011. The economic argument simply does not stand up to scrutiny, but it will continue to be made so long as Europe's birth rate remains sub-replacement. The argument is based on an optimistic but naive view that people are the products of circumstance, that people are driven by economic incentives alone rather than culture or religion, that if only we brought opportunities and prosperity to people, they would no longer hold on to such backward beliefs. Never mind that the Gulf states, super wealthy, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, have immense wealth and still practice slavery. Merely by being here in the West will the eyes of every immigrant open to the wonders of the Enlightenment. This was the belief at the end of the Cold War, that America had defeated the evil empire, the Soviet Union, with economics. This proved that Western culture, liberal democracy, and capitalism was superior. Francis Fukuyama famously claimed we had arrived at the end of history. But other civilizations did not agree. Fukuyama's teacher, Professor Samuel Huntington, responded, forecasting a clash of civilizations between the West and the Islamic world. When the Twin Towers were reduced to rubble, Huntington was proven right, and history began again, and it continues to this day. But the West stubbornly clings to the ideal of an end of history utopia, rather than reassess how liberalism blinded itself to the emerging threat of Islam. It sought to bring liberalism to Muslims. Many neoconservatives, and I was one of them, thought that regime change in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya would lead to liberal revolutions, the likes of which founded America. Their goal was a mix of Woodrow Wilson's promise to make the world safe for democracy and a hope that democracy would grow from the ashes of Islamic dictatorship. Both of those goals failed, and now we import millions of people from the places we went to war with, and we assume none of those immigrants hold any grudges against us. These two views, the social liberal and the Marxist view, result in record numbers of migrants entering Europe. So, to do, we also import the world's problems into Europe. Many migrants, especially Muslims, live close to one another, in enclaves, and begin to recreate the conditions of the failed states they fled. As I wrote about in my book, Pray, there are streets in London, in Paris, and in Berlin, which now could be mistaken for somewhere in Algiers, Mogadishu, or Lahore. Women are not allowed out of the house unsupervised, uncovered, or to speak out of turn. The second group at the marches we've been seeing since October 8th of last year were first and second generation Muslim immigrants. The prosperity of the West did not strip them of their anti-Semitism from the old world. Instead, the human rights afforded to minorities allow them to call for jihad and the genocide of Jews while being protected from criticism by their European hosts. I call this mindless immigration because no attention is paid to the cultural differences that are being imported, but it's only those enacting the policies who are willfully blind to these irreconcilable differences. Islamists know this and are playing the liberals of Europe for fools. While we were successful in destroying Al-Qaeda and later ISIS, the West allowed millions of Muslims to enter its countries and begin living in separate cultural universes to the host population. They do not see themselves as economic actors. They do not love the West and want to discover its history or contribute to its heritage. They see themselves as part of a project of da'wah. This is not, by the way, every Muslim, but those dance to the song of Islamists. This is a much more insidious effort to establish an Islamic state within the West through the growth of Islam, through conversion, through immigration, through persuasion. It recruits Muslims into its seditious political cause and non-Muslims into Islam. And I fear that the liberal indifference to culture and the self-hatred taught to our young people is rendering us powerless to stop it. Islam remains the world's fastest growing religion. Muslims are a quarter of the world's population. It's the fastest growing religion in Europe. In the UK, Muslims are 18% of the prison population, and 1 in 5 is a white convert. Britain's Christian population has shrunk to less than half, while its Muslim population has grown to 6.5%, by over 1 million since 2011. These are the official numbers. With a growth in demographics, Muslims are seeking political representation. In this year's general election, 4 MPs won exclusively on pro-Palestine platforms. They were independents, as there is no Muslim party to speak of yet. But there are organizations, such as the Muslim Vote, seeking to make sectarian religious politics permanent. Doing so advances Islam in a West in which Christianity and European culture is in retreat. One way that Islamists use liberals' standards against the West is by conflating anti-Islamism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. Since 2005, a network of 700 employees in the Home Office have worked to recruit more Muslim staff to influence policymakers and support Muslim needs. One of my restoration writers, Connor Tomlinson, told me they have spent millions on public image campaigns after terror attacks. After the London Bridge attack in 2017, the government apparently paid to send 100 imams to the site for a vigil to take photos. Similar efforts to improve public perception of Islam have happened since 2011. The groups they consult to combat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia bundled together have been accused of links to the Muslim Brotherhood. For those who don't know, the Muslim Brotherhood founded Hamas. Yet, after the October the 7th, both synagogues and mosques received funding for extra security. Why can the West not draw this distinction between Jews and Muslims when most anti-Semitism is not coming from Europeans, but from Islamist-driven institutions? 20 years ago, it seemed to me, because the horrors of the Holocaust made Europe afraid of being called racist. I remember the mayor of Amsterdam telling me that we should not treat Muslim minorities in Holland the same way that Germany treated Jews in the 1930s. Neither we nor the same Jews who live in the welcoming West can afford to make this conflation. But Islamists know how weak the West is to claims of victimhood and bigotry because it's the only culture in history to take it seriously. So it weaponizes human rights, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion, and the near pathological compassion given to minority groups to advance dawah. It does so because today's Western elite, or the Western elite mind, fails repeatedly to understand the objectives of Islamism. In order for civilizations to clash, you must feel you have one to belong to. Instead, the West allowed itself to become the battleground for a clash with Islam and then surrendered all willingness to fight. It brought soldiers of a foreign cause in and then laid down its arms. It hopes that surrender will be reciprocated. But there is no hope of assimilation with Islamism. In an issue of ISIS's English language magazine, Tabiq, an essay titled "Why We Hate You and Why We Fight You," the essay said, quote, "The fact is, even if you were to stop bombing us, imprisoning us, torturing us, vilifying us, and usurping our lands, we would continue to hate you because our primary reason for hating you will not cease to exist until you embrace Islam." End quote. It's a political ideology which does not share in our ancestry, our religious beliefs, our culture, or customs. There is no common principle to serve as a means for many Muslims to buy into the Western way of life. What is required is for an immigrant, Muslim or not, to assimilate. And to assimilate, one must completely reject those norms and those ideologies from home, their religion and their old way of life. This is why I came to the West and why I am not the common case for immigrants today. My time as an atheist was that long period of rejection. And over time, I grew to love the history and the religion of my new home. My children have joined its heritage. I now belong to this ancestry. I feel a part of this civilization that is the open society, and I'm so grateful to those who have accepted me. But the same cannot be said of many Islamist migrants who marry within isolated communities. They are brought up to see themselves as apart from their host culture. They see the people who live in the West as infidels, either to be converted or executed. What we as defenders of the West must understand is that we are not of the same tribe in the manner that Siedentop described it. As I've already quoted, there are verses of genocidal anti-Semitism in Islamic scripture. It cannot be said to be Abrahamic if it seeks to exterminate the people of Israel. While Jesus taught Christians not to cast stones unless we are ourselves without sin, Muhammad revived the punishment of stoning in Medina. Whereas Jews and Christians may learn to resolve their mistrust after the 20th century, there is no common ground to appeal to with Islamism. We do not worship the same God. The God of the Trinity is not the same God as Allah. We do not worship the same ancestors. We do not have the same belief in what is good. We do not have a shared perception of the meaning and purpose of life. I say we, not just as a Westerner, but as a Christian. I professed my conversion almost a year ago. I shocked my friend, Richard Dawkins, who now calls himself a cultural Christian. Though I greatly respect and adore him, I do not think it's enough to enjoy the art and songs of Christianity while deriding belief in its teachings. I have chosen to suspend my doubts in order to rediscover this great tradition. And I do so because if it has worked for a millennia in Europe and America, because it has worked for a millennia in Europe and in America and beyond, Judge for yourself. Where would you rather live? In the Christian West or in the House of Islam? Millions vote with their feet. Beneath the rediscovery of who we are through our history must be a revival of the source of our moral legitimacy, of Christianity. I know that Professor Starkey will be shaking his head here, but without Christianity, we have no reason to assert the sacredness for human life, as do many or all of my atheist friends. Any proper appeal to human rights does not make sense. A secular humanist can only say, I hope human life is worth protecting. It's because of this principle that we are made in the image of God that Britain abolished the slave trade. Britain did not embark on that crusade because of human rights. It did so because it could not bear to see her Christian brothers and sisters in bondage. It's because of Christianity that Lord Bentinck fought bride banning, child marriage, and infanticide in India. Without Christianity, Britain would not have done the things which give the West the right to claim to be a better civilization than the brutal empires of Islam or antiquity. Rome would not have stopped burying the bodies of infant boys beneath brothels or leaving unwanted babies to die in landfills. The very Holocaust we want never to happen again would mean nothing if we did not believe that the life of a Jew mattered as much as that of a Gentile. There are some who still assert that reason and science can provide a shared morality to overcome religious conflicts. But as their theories have yet to prove how consciousness evolved, this is as much a statement of faith as my belief in Christ. More importantly, the Islamists are not interested in negotiating. Only an equally convincing story to marshal the spirits of those in the West to defend their tribe and traditions will work. Christianity pulled me through a period of deep despair. Perhaps it may redeem our depressed West too. The West should learn from Israel to be mindful of its history and its mission. As Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire reminds us of the fact that Europe had its own October 7th. In 1571, the Pope Pius V gathered the Spanish, Italian, and Greek navies to fight the Ottoman Empire. European states came together with a common religion and purpose to repel Islamic invaders. Without this, Europe would not have had its cathedrals, its art, and its identity. It may have fallen out of fashion to think so, but wars are still theological. Israel's war against Hamas, Hezbollah, and other proxies of Iran's mullah is a holy war. Europe's struggle for identity against the long march of da'wah through the West is a holy war. Not because you think it or you say so, but because they think it and they say so. We must hope that as we were in the 16th century, both Israel and the West are victorious in this existential struggle for the survival of our tribes. Do not let the idiots or the Islamists win. Thank you.
Before we start a conversation, I thought it might be an idea to tell you who the hell I am. Significantly, I worked in the Home Office for 4.5 years, between 2010 and just before 2015. And then before that, I went in, or after that, rather, I went into Downing Street. So I was there for the London Bridge marauding attack. And I've been in government where we've had all these very difficult debates, and I apologise. So that's me, and I think, you know, that speech covered so much ground, and each and every bit of that ground that you've covered is complex in so many different ways. So I'm going to try and see if we can unpick a little bit of it tonight. 20 years ago, you started this conversation. We're having this conversation again this evening.
Yeah.
But more importantly, we're having that conversation this evening when actually the world has become, I think, arguably even more dangerous and complex. We see our own, in the West, strategic competition and our enemies using things like migration as a form of de facto war. How do we start now when we're almost in a position where we haven't been able to necessarily solve the past 20 years, but we now have this additional pressure, which is not going anywhere soon?
Yeah. Well, I think we said 20 years ago, but I think it's important to go back. By the way, can you hear me in the back? Yes, good. It's important to go back maybe 30 years. I came to the West in 1992. And for those of you who are old enough, the 1990s were this transitional period that was quite utopian. The Soviet Union was defeated, the wall had come down, everybody on the other side was just going to become like us. It was going to be a matter of time. And so we had developed this narrative. I remember telling you, we had, when I became a politician in 2003, one of my colleagues who held the portfolio for development aid gave it to me. We were giving money to China because we were helping lift China up out of poverty. That was the idea. And I think that was shattered by 9/11/2001. It came in, and it wasn't just what happened in America. It was also what happened on our streets. There were people who had lived here among us, even young children, who went and celebrated the attack, and we didn't understand it. We refused to understand it. And what I discern looking back now is that we have lived, or at least our Western leaders, and when I talk about leaders, I'm not only talking about politicians, I'm talking about academics, I'm talking about journalists. Many of them lived in this state of denial. We were so intent on clinging to this paradise that we got a glimpse of in the 1990s, that we weren't opening ourselves up to reality again. And every academic, every journalist, every politician, every leader who thought of, showing us that reality was evicted from polite conversation, like an allergy. So we killed our Cassandras, we evicted them, we silenced them, and we find ourselves in this state where the problems that 9/11/2001 introduced got only bigger, and we made mistake after mistake. We went to wars that were not properly thought through. And at the same time, we embarked on this idea of opening up our borders, first obviously within Europe, but that wasn't well thought through. And I think the naive but optimistic and noble idea that if we share what we have, and if we economically and materially lift others up, they will become like us. It's turned from being a theoretical approach to a dogma. And dogmas are not good.
So when I think about it, what you've just explained, that was what I refer to as old world order, the old world order that came out of a post-1945 consensus that led to the UN and various other multilateral institutions. If we want to be optimistic, and I think that being optimistic is always a good thing, and we look at, well, what's the new world order? How do we get the balance between atoning for the past, but looking forward in a pragmatic way where we have relationships which are at much more eye level, not just necessarily in the atonement, but also in the lack of naivety and perhaps a little bit of arrogance that says to other countries, well, we won't be happy to do the business the way that we have done in the past. If you agree with that, how would you now do business?
The atoning, we've got to stop the atonement and the atoning. I think there's a lot of arrogance and ignorance that's hiding in this atoning, and maybe a sense of also powerlessness and confusion. And of course, all the cynics then come in and take advantage of that, and the world is full of cynics on every side. So the atoning has to stop, and I agree with you that we now have to have these eye-level conversations and say, what we have in the West is an outcome of millennia of struggle and suffering and blood and sweat. And the outcome, the prosperity you see now, is not something that we want to take for granted. And we would like to share with you the principles and the values and the norms and the customs that could lead to a similar outcome. I'm thinking of South Korea, for instance. You take these Western values and you apply them somewhere else in other parts of the world, and they lead to similar outcomes. So we can share those things with you, but we're going to have, when you say eye level, I would say frank and fair discussions about where responsibilities lie. We cannot take responsibility for failed and failing states in Africa, where you have it in two ways. Those states fail in the Africa and Middle East and the rest of the third world. The people come here, we send them development aid, and then we start lashing ourselves about, oh, we colonized them and we enslaved them, while as we know from history, that enslaving and colonization and empire, that's just part of the human condition. It's not something that's exclusively Western. And in fact, that's slightly probably what is a little arrogant about the Western attitude of thinking that only the West had empires. Everyone had empires.
I mean, this is not widely reported at the moment, but there is a very serious rise of jihadism across the Sahel at the moment, which you've really got to struggle to find out about if you're in the West, mainly because there's a world of competing priorities of what the media can report on, of what Western leaders need to think about. How do you think that we raise those issues, and how do you think that we not just raise them, but actually filter them down to everyday civilians, electorates, communities? Because this is clearly so big that you need the support, like a campaign. I mean, if you think about the groups of people that you've been speaking about and saying that this is a holy war, you know, they're in a campaign. You know, it's not just war, it's a campaign. How does the West now build a campaign? And what are the main areas that you think are key component parts of that campaign? What should they be?
I think what I'm seeing now is that the West itself is on the brink of falling into disunity and polarization. I mean, you must be watching the American elections. You must be watching your own country and how growing number of native Westerners are feeling the pinch of globalization. They're feeling a sense of poverty and crime and grime and hopelessness. And so I think we, first of all, have to reassert the idea of nationhood and national interest, take care of our own people, take care of our own countries. Now, if we feel strong enough to help others, we can do that, but it can't be on their terms. It has to be on our terms. Jihadism is spreading across the Sahel, it's spreading across Africa, it's spreading in parts of Asia where jihadism thrives on chaos. And so where there are weak states, jihadist groups will establish themselves. Their objective is to Islamize the world. That's the objective of an Islamist. That's the campaign. That's the project. And right now, it's not just in the Sahel. It's in Europe, and it's in America, and it's growing everywhere. I see a small sign of hope, which I think we can build on when it comes to fighting the ideology of jihadism. And this comes from Saudi Arabia. The current Saudi government is not in the business of giving money and shelter and homeland and legitimacy to the Islamists. The Saudi Arabia has evicted the Muslim Brotherhood out of their countries, and so has the UAE. So I think now is an opportunity diplomatically to build on that and to starve Islamists of funding. Let's start with that. And then we could have perhaps internationally organized military forms to evict them out of those places where they want to set up their vanguards and their organizations, out of where they can launch terrorist attacks or where they can take over whole societies. We can do all of that, but we can't do that as long as in every Western nation, the center-left parties have allowed groups that either represent the Islamists, using multiculturalism as an argument, saying diversity, equity, and inclusion, to allow them to insinuate themselves into the system. And then you have these, in America we call them the woke for shorthand, but these self-hating groups who want to explicitly say they want to bring down the structures of the West. We have to take care of these problems ourselves. And I think when you say, let's start with a blank slate, then the blank slate starts to look like, what is my house going to look like first? And our homes, Western countries teetering on the brink of chaos. I think the issue of the demographics is really, it's an alarming one. According to the Center for Policy Studies, 50% of Britain is going to be either foreign-born or the children of, or the grandchildren of foreign-born people, and this is going to be in the year 2040. If they're correct, that's only 16 years from now. Now, I'm not saying every foreign-born individual in Britain is a threat. That it's far from that. I think there are communities who are doing much better in Britain than even the white British. The Indians, the Sikh, many Chinese people are doing very, very well. And like me, they've adopted and understand exactly the value of Western civilization. But still, we have, I think, too many people who are here, are citizens of here, are born here, are raised here, but are not of here. And if you have only 16 years before there is this 50-50%, then you make it more difficult with each passing year to achieve full integration or assimilation. And multiculturalism as an idea, as a philosophy, as a recipe for assimilating people from elsewhere, it's just failed. It's been a very dangerous philosophy, and I think it should be thrown out.
How do we, I think do you accept that the world is a much more divisive and divided place?
The world is a much more dangerous place today than when I came here 30 years ago. Yeah. And I think we messed up. I think we we just insisted on economics and materialism, and we neglected to address the meaning and purpose of life. And we absolutely neglected to see that values are different, and they are hierarchical, and some values are superior to others. And we failed to invest in those superior values in our schools and in our universities, in our media, in the institutions that shape human thinking. We failed to, as Westerners, to invest in that. People like me who got it's because I'm interested in it. I think we should have had You know, the Islamists have this relentless effort, da'wah effort, and we should really set up this relentless counter-da'wah effort, insisting that our way of life is superior. And empirically, that is proven.
Well, and also democracy is a bit harder to manage. Democracy is a bit harder to manage. How do we, going back to the division point, if you look at what's happening across Europe, most recently in Germany, how do we prevent the division getting to the stage where, you know, I guess, you know, people go so far to the right that then that's almost used as an excuse not to allow the pendulum to actually be in the middle. How do we prevent that?
I think one of the things we do in a democracy is we have to listen to the voters. So again, America is my reference point, but we can use Germany as an example. We can use Britain as an example, or France, the Netherlands where I lived. If you listen very carefully to what the voters are saying over and over again, in every Western country, you're going to find a few similarities. And I think there is no shortcut but to address those things. So globalization has worked for some of us. I'm a beneficiary of globalization, so I shouldn't say anything bad about it. But it'd be hugely selfish of me to say it has worked for everyone. It hasn't worked for everyone. And so let's address why that is the case. Is it sensible to continue to have the crazy immigration policies that we have now, while, you know, election result after election result shows that voters, it's straining the social cohesion of every country that has imported so many people? Is it sensible that if you've brought so many people, you've allowed them to stay as long as they have, not to embark on programs of assimilation while you bring in more and more people? Is it sensible in this day and age with China not just a rising power, but a hostile rising power, with Iran as it's doing, with Putin and this war, which may not stop in Ukraine, is it sensible to say we're going to shut off fossil fuels as a source of energy, and that we're going to do it by the year 2030? And where does that leave? Because you go down the list of things that people complain about, and you see that some of these things are actually quite practical. Why can't we not postpone some of these policy proposals, if we even want them, until everyone is ready, until you have voter buy-in? Europe, there was Brexit here. But again, if I listen to my Dutch friends, listen to the French, to the Germans, to the Italians, if the leaders of the EU want this project to be a success, then I think they'll have to learn to relinquish some of the decision-making and give it back to the nation states. That's what voters want. If they continue to overreach, the whole thing is going to come crumbling down. So a lot of it is really sensible, common sense. You know, we're in America now. We live in California. It's pushed down your throat, this idea that there are more than two sexes, and that parents, there's a law that says, parents will not be consulted if a 13-year-old or 14-year-old goes behind the parents' back and to go in and embark on these surgeries that are damaging and life-changing. Why not listen to vote? In California, they said, you can't ask for voter IDs. Why would you do something like that? That is an elite that is so disconnected from the people they govern, and that every Western country, to a lesser or more degree, is going through this disconnection between those who govern and those who are governed. And that is why when other actors come in, and you can call them populist, you can call them racist, you can call them this is and that is, but people have to go somewhere. And I think we're still fortunate that voters want to use the channels of democracy, the ballot box, to express their frustrations, or that they want to use social media to express their frustrations. I think you have to be really careful of what I saw in Africa and in other parts when citizens feel there is absolutely no other outlet and they find themselves with their backs against the wall, and then they start to revert to really bad stuff that you don't want to see here, which you only see either in the third world or in bad movies, but you don't want that sort of thing here. So the sooner we wake up to these things, and the sooner we listen to voters, the better. It's a disconnect between the elite, the governed, and the governors that I think, I would say, practically speaking, I would start by narrowing that.
Well, it's certainly true to say, as a British person, watching the death of the North Sea breaks my heart, especially when it coincides with China building the biggest oil platform the world has ever actually seen. Going back to how we get over division and how we keep dialogue and how we try and get this new world order into a better arrangement than perhaps the previous one was. And you touched upon the UN in your speech. You know, not wanting to be disruptive, because I'm not sure that always is a good way forward, but putting the UN to one side, and we can talk about, if you wish, the effectiveness of or otherwise of the UN at the moment.
Well, the UN, the problem with the UN is now it's an incentive structure. Right now, the incentives as they are, they incentivize the leadership within the UN to really do bad things and bad things alone. And that's because they get all this money and it's unaccounted for. Who holds the UN accountable? And I think that we have to bring in some kind of either a serious and effective accountability mechanism for the UN, the World Health Organization, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. You may have heard of UNRWA. This is a small group, small agency that was supposed to look after the needs of the 750,000 people who were displaced, 70 years ago. And it turned out to become part of Hamas and part of the terrorists. And that is when you don't have any accountability in place. Or the Geneva Convention, the Refugee and Asylum Convention, that we pay a lot of money to the United Nations to keep some of those countries stable. And if the money goes, the West pays money via the UN and sometimes directly to countries, but the people keep coming and the nations keep failing and, the refugees. So I think you have to start having what you call that eye-level discussion, where some of these treaties, like the Asylum and Refugee Treaty, that's outdated completely, that needs to go. There has to be a serious repurposing of that organization if it's going to have any meaning at all.
I think if the UN can't be a safe space for honest dialogue and asking honest answers and moreover asking honest questions, then what else? What other is, I suppose what I'm asking is there a need for a new multilateral world with different countries that may have not necessarily been in the same multilateral or even minilateral groupings?
So the late John McCain, I think years while he was still alive, I don't know if it was maybe even before he ran for president, while he was still trying to run for president, had spoken about replacing the United Nations. He wanted to abandon it altogether or maybe establish nations with a common set of principles. And I think that we take it for granted, perhaps through NATO or the EU or the special relationship that we have with the US, that these things exist. But I think we don't have a formal plan B, where we say the United Nations is not working for us. Here we are, this group of nations that come together with a common interest, common values, common outlook, and we're going to guarantee membership based on, and you can have your criteria for that, just don't make it like the EU. These agencies then tend to drift into mission.
They have their own cultures which develop over time, and that means it's very difficult when you're working in that culture, I suppose, to then think in a different way and have conversations with different people in a different way. So, we've been speaking about fairly heavy subjects now for quite a long time. And I wondered if perhaps we might talk about what you're doing next and your next project, because obviously you're a workaholic.
I'm not a workaholic, I'm still...
I don't believe you've not got something up your sleeve.
Deep inside, I'm still a very lazy African. I'm not really an alcoholic, and actually a workaholic. If all these, interesting problems didn't exist, I'd be doing gardening, roots, and doing things like that. I just launched Carriage Media, a platform where I hope to encourage people to come and first to read it, but also to come and share their ideas. If they think that it's a brave idea and that they don't need to conform. I'm also working on a book, Why I Am a Christian Now, tongue-in-cheek, borrowed from Bertrand Russell had written that essay, Why I Am a Christian. And it's like, why I am Christian, why I'm not. He wrote, Why I Am Not a Christian. And the title of my book is Why I Am a Christian. So I have a lot of work, and of course I have the boys, and my husband is always traveling, so I'm very busy.
Going back to becoming a Christian, are you going to church every week?
I try to.
You do?
Yeah.
Because, of course, one of the problems we do have in the West is that actually, the number of people going to church is just not what it was.
There's a paradox.
These generations.
The number of people going to church is going down and has been steadily going down for a long time. But the number of people who are seeking spirituality is going up. And I see a change now that I didn't see in the past. And I think that maybe if the traditional churches were to take the trouble to reach out and to offer the original message, the traditional, these are the complaints that I hear. People who are trying to escape from the ideas of the woke and the wokeism, when they go to the Anglican church and they hear the exact same language, they flee and they think, what the heck is this? So maybe if the traditional churches were to offer them the original message, I think you would have it. I've, for instance, seen Catholic churches bursting at the seams. And, was it G.K. Chesterton who said, it's, when people don't believe, when you stop believing in God, it's not that you'll believe in reason, it's you'll believe in anything.
I think also it's charismatic leadership as well. I mean, my own church in Blackheath, where I live in London, has become popular again just because there's a new priest. He's charismatic and people want to go back again.
There's charismatic leadership. There is an alarming growth in the rise of people converting to Islam. There's an alarming growth in the despair, people who are depressed, suicidal, drugs. I mean, the people who are dying of overdoses are young men in particular, and many of them white young men. So I think there's a lot to be done. We just need to come out of this state of denial and mental stasis that we've been in for a while.
So, Ayaan, maybe you should become a vicar? Maybe once you've done these projects, maybe that should be your next.
It will take a long time for me to train as a vicar.
We could phone Dawn French and ask her to help.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you so much for all your words and your wonderful speech. Thought-provoking, sounds a bit cliched, because obviously you have been speaking about it for 20 years. Yeah. But clearly it is so difficult. And the world is going through so much change that obviously the debate is unlikely to stop anytime soon. And so we implore you to keep making these speeches. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.